Sarah Mitchell's peaceful life in Sunridge Estates took an unexpected turn on a crisp autumn morning. She discovered an official-looking envelope tucked into her doorframe, containing a notice about her newly planted rose garden. According to the letter, her beautiful flowers were somehow against the neighborhood rules. The signature at the bottom belonged to Gerald Watson, her next-door neighbor who had recently become the Homeowners Association president. Sarah felt confused. At least 5 other houses on her street had similar gardens. When she checked the official guidelines that evening, she found nothing prohibiting flower gardens. The next day, she noticed Gerald watching from his window as she examined her roses, a strange smile playing across his face. Something didn't feel right. After a long day at work as a project manager for a local marketing firm, Sarah decided to address the issue directly. She walked across her perfectly manicured lawn to Gerald's Tudor-style home and rang the doorbell. The chimes echoed inside the house, followed by the sound of footsteps. "Sarah, what a pleasant surprise," Gerald said as he opened the door, though his tone suggested it was anything but pleasant. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the late afternoon sunlight as he looked down at her from his porch. "Hey Gerald, I got this notice about my rose garden," Sarah said, holding up the paper. "I've checked the guidelines twice and couldn't find anything that says rose gardens aren't allowed. The Martinez family has one, and the Thompsons down the street have an entire flower bed." Gerald's smile tightened. "Yes, well, the board recently passed some updates to our landscaping standards. Certain plants attract pests, you see, bad for property values. Can I see these new guidelines? They weren't on the association website this morning." Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly. "They're being formatted for posting. I can assure you they were properly voted on. The fine stands at $250, due by Friday." As Sarah walked back to her house, she noticed something odd. Gerald immediately made a phone call, gesturing animatedly while looking in her direction. That evening, she emailed the association secretary, Diane, requesting a copy of the updated guidelines and meeting minutes where they were approved. The response came the next morning. "No recent changes to landscaping rules have been approved." The last update was 14 months ago. Sarah printed the email and took photos of several gardens in the neighborhood identical to hers. She was preparing to contest the fine when her doorbell rang. It was Patricia Weber, the elderly woman who lived across the street. "I couldn't help noticing you talking with Gerald yesterday," Patricia said in a hushed voice. "Be careful with him. My husband and I have lived here for 12 years, and we've never had problems until Gerald moved in last summer." "What kind of problems?" Sarah asked, inviting Patricia in for coffee. "It started with small complaints, our bird feeder, then our holiday decorations. When my husband contested them at the meeting, suddenly we had more violations. Gerald kept pressuring us to sell. Said he had a friend interested in our property." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm coffee cup in her hands. "Did you end up selling?" "Heavens no," Patricia said. "My Harold may be 74, but he was a lawyer for 40 years. He threatened to sue, and Gerald backed off. For now." As Patricia left, Sarah noticed Gerald across the street, photographing her mailbox with his phone. That afternoon, she installed a small security camera under her porch eave, angled to capture her front yard and the street. She had a feeling this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a dispute over roses. 2 days later, a second notice appeared, this time claiming her house trim color wasn't approved. Sarah checked her closing documents. The color had been pre-approved by the association when the previous owners painted it 3 years ago. The new fine was $500. Within weeks, Sarah's mailbox was flooded with notices for increasingly bizarre issues. The color of her mailbox, the same one installed by the builder. Her porch light, identical to others on the street. And even the position of her car in her own driveway. At the monthly association meeting, Sarah presented evidence that her property matched others in the neighborhood, but Gerald and his newly appointed friends on the board dismissed her concerns. The financial penalties now totaled over $3,000. After the meeting, An elderly couple approached Sarah in the parking lot. "He's doing the same thing to us," they whispered. "We're afraid we'll lose our retirement home." Sarah drove home wondering how many others were suffering in silence. The following Tuesday, Sarah found yet another envelope wedged in her door. This time, the notice claimed her garbage can had been left at the curb 12 hours after collection, a $350 penalty. Sarah checked her security camera footage immediately. The timestamps clearly showed she had pulled the can back to its proper place beside the garage barely an hour after the collection truck left. Something caught her eye in the footage from 11 p.m. that night, a figure moving across her driveway. She zoomed in and recognized Gerald's distinctive gait as he pulled her garbage can back to the curb, photographed it, and then returned to his house. "This is unbelievable," Sarah muttered, downloading the video to her laptop. The next morning, Sarah spotted another neighbor, Michael Jimenez, receiving a similar envelope. She hurried across the street. "Let me guess, a notice from the association?" Sarah asked. Michael nodded, his expression grim. "Third one this month. Apparently, my kid's basketball hoop is too tall. It's the standard 10 feet. Has Gerald spoken to you about your house?" Sarah asked carefully. Michael hesitated. He mentioned his brother-in-law is looking to buy in the neighborhood, suggested I might want to simplify my life and sell before the fines add up. He shook his head. "My family loves this house. We're not going anywhere." That evening, Sarah created a private social media group titled Sunridge Neighbors and invited several households who had received similar notices. By midnight, 15 people had joined. The story shared a disturbing pattern: multiple notices, escalating fines, and subtle pressure to sell. A real estate agent in the neighborhood, Anita Sharma, posted, "I've noticed something odd. 3 houses sold well below market value last year. All went to different buyers on paper, but I've seen Gerald meeting with each one. They might be shell companies or friends helping him flip properties." The group decided to attend the next board meeting together. Sarah spent the weekend gathering evidence, photographs of identical features on different houses, with only some receiving notices, and her video of Gerald moving her garbage can. On Monday, Sarah received a certified letter stating her fines were being sent to collections. That same day, her boss called her into his office. "Sarah, I received a strange call from someone named Gerald Watson. He claimed to be from your neighborhood association and said you've been harassing him. Normally, I'd ignore this kind of thing, but he mentioned potential legal action that could affect the company." Sarah felt her face grow hot. "He's trying to intimidate me because I'm challenging his abuse of power." Her boss nodded. "I figured it was something like that. Just be careful. This guy seems willing to play dirty." That night, Sarah noticed a car she didn't recognize parked outside her house. The driver appeared to be taking photographs. When she stepped onto her porch, the car drove away quickly. Her phone chimed with a message from the neighbors group. "Emergency meeting tomorrow night at my house. Gerald's targeting more of us. Come through the back gate. Don't tell anyone. Michael." The certified letter that arrived next made Sarah's heart race. It stated the association was taking steps to secure payment for the alleged unpaid penalties. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Gerald. "This could all go away if you consider my offer to purchase your property. I'm thinking 70% of market value would be fair, given the circumstances." That evening, Sarah spotted Gerald hosting a dinner party. Through his dining room window, she could see him pointing at a map of the neighborhood with several houses, including hers, circled in red. A quick online search revealed 3 homes in Gerald's previous neighborhood had been sold to him under similar mysterious circumstances. That night, Sarah's phone rang. "I heard you got the letter today," Gerald said without introducing himself. "Some people just aren't cut out for living in nice neighborhoods." Sarah's hand trembled as she hung up the phone. The threat in Gerald's voice had been unmistakable. She immediately called Patricia Weber, who connected her with Harold, her retired lawyer husband. A lying threat based on unapproved fines is legally questionable. Harold explained after reviewing Sarah's documents. But fighting it could be expensive and time-consuming. That's what he's counting on. The emergency meeting at Michael's house drew 12 neighbors, all sharing similar stories. They gathered in his finished basement, speaking in hushed tones despite being away from prying eyes. "He's accelerating his timeline," said Anita, the real estate agent. "Spring market is approaching. If he can force quick sales, he stands to make significant profits when he flips these properties." Sarah shared her security footage and the evidence she'd gathered. "We need to understand exactly how he's operating. Has anyone checked whether these rule changes were properly filed with the county?" "I did," said Robert Chen, an accountant who lived on the next street. "There's no record of official amendments to our covenants in the past 2 years. He's essentially making up rules." As the meeting concluded, they formed an action committee with Sarah as the coordinator. The next morning, she drove to the county records office to research property transactions linked to Gerald. What she discovered was disturbing. Gerald appeared to have connections to a small property development company that had been buying and quickly reselling homes in upscale neighborhoods across the county. The pattern was always the same: purchase at significantly below market value, minimal renovations, then resale at premium prices. When Sarah returned home, a sleek black car was parked in her driveway. Gerald leaned against it, smiling broadly. "Just thought I'd stop by to see if you considered my offer," he said, his tone falsely pleasant. "I'm not selling, Gerald," Sarah replied firmly, staying near her car. His smile faded. "You know, I had someone from the health department look at those roses. They attract certain beetles that can spread plant diseases. They might need to declare your garden a neighborhood hazard." "That's ridiculous, and you know it," Sarah said. Gerald shrugged. "Things get complicated when people don't cooperate. Ask the Andersons. They finally sold to me last year after fighting for months. The stress was affecting their health." "Is that a threat?" Sarah asked, recording the conversation discreetly on her phone. "Just friendly advice from your association president," Gerald replied, straightening his expensive jacket. "By the way, I've scheduled a special board meeting tomorrow to discuss your case specifically. I wouldn't miss it if I were you." As Gerald drove away, Sarah noticed an official-looking paper tucked under her windshield wiper. A notice of hearing from the association, scheduled for 10 a.m. the next day. The timing was no coincidence. Most residents would be at work and unable to attend. Gerald was making his move, and Sarah had less than 24 hours to prepare her defense. Sarah's background in corporate record-keeping proved valuable as she began documenting everything. Her security cameras captured Gerald measuring the height of her grass at dawn and placing something in her yard that he later photographed as evidence. Sarah's research at the county records office revealed Gerald had never properly filed several rule changes he was now enforcing. Most importantly, she discovered the association had let crucial legal protections lapse, making many of their actions potentially invalid. Sarah created a private online group where affected neighbors could share their experiences. By week's end, 15 households had joined, each with similar stories. "He's not just bending the rules," Sarah told them. "I think he's trying to flip our houses for profit." Sarah barely slept that night, preparing for the emergency hearing. She called in sick to work and spent the morning organizing her evidence into a clear, compelling presentation. At 9:30 a.m., she parked a block away from the community center and walked briskly to the meeting room. As expected, the room was nearly empty. Just Gerald, 3 board members who always supported him, and a man in an expensive suit whom Sarah didn't recognize. She nodded politely and took a seat, placing her laptop and files on the table. "This is a closed session, Sarah," Gerald said smoothly. "Just board members and our legal counsel." "Actually," Sarah replied, "according to our bylaws, Section 5.3, any homeowner facing potential action has the right to attend and present evidence at all relevant meetings." Gerald's expression hardened. "You've been reading the fine print." "Someone should," Sarah said calmly. The man in the suit leaned forward. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jeffrey Winters, representing the association. Given the amount of your unpaid fines, we're considering placing a lion on your property. Before we proceed, Sarah said, I'd like to confirm something. She pulled out a document. This is the current insurance certificate for the association. It expired 3 months ago. According to state law, an uninsured association cannot legally enforce monetary penalties. Jeffrey frowned, glancing at Gerald, who was suddenly very interested in his phone. Furthermore, Sarah continued, opening her laptop, I have evidence that President Watson has been falsifying violations. She played the video showing Gerald placing an object in her yard, then photographing it as a violation. The room fell silent. One board member, Lisa Thompson, looked particularly uncomfortable. I believe we should adjourn to review these allegations, Jeffrey said finally. One more thing, Sarah said, sliding a document across the table. This is a petition signed by 23 homeowners requesting an emergency election under Bylaw Section 7.2, citing abuse of power and procedural violations. Gerald's face flushed dark red. This is ridiculous. You're just trying to avoid paying legitimate fines. Speaking of legitimate, Sarah continued, displaying county records on her laptop screen. There's no record of any approved change to our landscaping rules in the past 3 years. Yet you've issued over $30,000 in related fines to various homeowners. Lisa Thompson stood suddenly. I've seen enough. I move to suspend all pending fines until we can verify the proper procedure was followed for rule changes. Another board member, James Wilson, who had remained silent until now, seconded the motion. Gerald slammed his hand on the table. You can't do this. I'm the president. Actually, James said quietly, the board can vote to suspend enforcement actions with a simple majority. I've been on this board for 12 years, Gerald. I've never seen anything like what's happening now. The vote was 3-2 to suspend all fines, with Gerald and one ally opposed. As the meeting adjourned, Gerald cornered Sarah by the door. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he hissed. This isn't over. Sarah met his gaze steadily. You're right about that. The investigation is just beginning. Rather than address each issue separately, Sarah and her neighbors prepared a comprehensive case. At the next association meeting, Gerald was surprised to find the room packed with residents. When he tried to rush through agenda items, Sarah stood up. I'd like to discuss the selective enforcement of rules that don't exist, she announced, connecting her laptop to the projector. The room fell silent as she displayed time-stamped photos showing identical features on different houses, some with penalties, some without. The most damning evidence came when she played security footage of Gerald planting lawn ornaments on her property before taking evidence photos. A board member who had remained silent until now spoke up. I think we need an emergency election. Gerald's face turned pale as he realized he had lost control of the narrative and potentially his investment scheme. The week following the contentious board meeting had been surprisingly quiet. Too quiet, Sarah thought as she watered her roses. Gerald's car hadn't moved from his driveway for 3 days, but lights switched on and off in his house at regular intervals. He's planning something, Patricia Weber said, joining Sarah by the garden. Harold says we should proceed with the emergency election as quickly as possible. Sarah nodded. The bylaws require 10 days' notice. We've already posted it on the community board and sent official emails. That afternoon, Sarah received a call from an unknown number. Ms. Mitchell, this is Detective Rivera with the Economic Crimes Unit. We've received some interesting information about your neighborhood association. Do you have time to meet? At the police station, Sarah was surprised to find Lisa Thompson, the board member who had supported the motion to suspend fines. I've been the association treasurer for 5 years, Lisa explained. After our meeting, I reviewed our accounts more carefully. Gerald has been depositing checks from homeowners, but not all of that money is reaching our official accounts. Detective Rivera nodded. We're investigating similar patterns in 2 other neighborhoods where Mr. Watson previously lived. The following day, A moving truck appeared in front of Gerald's house. Sarah called James Wilson, who immediately drove over. "He can't just leave," James said, watching workers carry furniture. "The election is in 3 days." "Actually," came a voice behind them, "I'm not going anywhere." Gerald approached, smiling confidently. "Just some spring cleaning. Getting rid of old furniture." Sarah noticed his smile didn't reach his eyes. Strange timing. "By the way," Gerald added, "I filed a restraining order against you, Sarah. Harassment, defamation, serious charges. You'll be served tomorrow. Unfortunately, that means you won't be able to attend any association meetings for a while, including the upcoming election." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm spring air. "You can't silence everyone, Gerald." "I don't need to," he replied. "Just the ringleaders." That evening, Sarah's neighbors group met at Robert Chen's house. The mood was grim. If he manages to block Sarah from the meeting, people might lose courage, Michael worried. "Then we need to make sure everyone sees the evidence before the meeting," Sarah said. "We have 3 days." They divided responsibilities. Robert would create a secure website with all the documentation. Anita would handle door-to-door outreach. James would review legal options with Harold. Sarah returned home to find her front door slightly ajar. Heart pounding, she called the police before entering. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed until she reached her home office. Her laptop was gone, along with her external hard drive containing her evidence files. A note sat on her desk. "Checkmate. Gee." Sarah smiled despite the break-in. Gerald didn't know about her cloud backups or the copies distributed among neighbors. His desperate move only confirmed his guilt and provided fresh evidence of criminal activity. She called Detective Rivera immediately. "I think we just got our smoking gun." The special election brought record turnout, with Gerald and his allies removed from their positions by an overwhelming margin. The new leadership immediately canceled all questionable penalties and hired an independent auditor. Sarah was asked to join the Architectural Review Committee to help create fair, clear standards. The investigation revealed Gerald had been purchasing properties below market value and quickly reselling them for substantial profit. 3 months later, Sarah hosted the neighborhood's first-ever garden tour, showcasing the diverse and beautiful landscaping that had once been under threat. The following week, a for sale sign appeared in front of Gerald's house. The online listing showed a surprisingly low asking price, the same 30% discount he had demanded from others. Sarah smiled as she walked past it on her morning stroll, stopping to admire her roses that had grown more beautiful than ever. The morning of the election arrived with unexpected drama. Despite Gerald's threats, no restraining order had materialized. Detective Rivera's involvement had apparently given Gerald second thoughts. Instead, Gerald sent an email to all homeowners claiming emergency association business required postponing the election. "He's getting desperate," Harold Weber told the gathered neighbors at the community center. "The bylaws are clear. Once an election is properly called, it can only be postponed by majority vote of all homeowners." When Gerald arrived with his attorney, he found over 80% of Sunridge Estates homeowners already present. His confident smile faltered as James Wilson, serving as interim chair, called the meeting to order. "We have 2 items on today's agenda," James announced. "First, the emergency election. Second, a report on the preliminary findings of our financial review." Gerald stood up. "I object to these proceedings." "As president." "You can object after we vote," James interrupted firmly. "We're following proper procedure, as documented in our bylaws." The voting was conducted by paper ballot with 3 neutral observers counting. The results were decisive. Gerald and his 2 closest allies on the board were removed by an overwhelming 87% majority. The crowd erupted in applause as Lisa Thompson was elected interim president. Gerald's attorney whispered something in his ear, then gathered his briefcase and left without another word. Gerald remained, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Lisa took the podium. "Now for our second agenda item, Our preliminary financial review has identified approximately $42,000 in homeowner payments that never reached association accounts. We've reported these findings to the authorities. On cue, Detective Rivera entered from the back of the room, accompanied by 2 officers. They approached Gerald, who suddenly looked much smaller than he had moments before. "Gerald Watson, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and breaking and entering," Detective Rivera announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. As Gerald was escorted out, many residents approached Sarah with thanks and congratulations. She accepted them graciously, but felt strangely hollow watching Gerald's downfall. His scheme had caused so much stress and fear throughout the neighborhood. 6 weeks later, Sunridge Estates felt transformed. The new board had established clear, fair guidelines for home maintenance and improvements. An atmosphere of community had replaced suspicion and fear. Sarah's rose garden had become something of a neighborhood symbol, with several residents asking her advice on starting their own gardens. One evening, as Sarah tended her flourishing roses, a moving truck arrived at Gerald's house. The property had finally sold after sitting vacant since his arrest. A young couple emerged from a car parked behind the truck, looking excited about their new home. Sarah waved in welcome. The woman approached, admiring the roses. "Those are beautiful. I hope we can create something similar," she said warmly. "I'd be happy to help you get started," Sarah replied. "That's what neighbors do." As they chatted about gardening, Sarah glanced at Gerald's former house. The sold sign swayed gently in the evening breeze, sold at fair market value, through a reputable agent, to a family who would contribute to the community rather than exploit it. Sweet justice indeed.